Well, good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on from where you're joining us in the world today. I'm delighted to welcome you to the first in our 2023 series of webinars on fundraising and sport development. So we're now into the third year of this series, and what a 3 years we've had to cover. Started with the COVID-19 pandemic, then the ongoing war in Ukraine, and the global cost of living crisis. That's just to name 3 seismic international events that we've had to kind of navigate through. So I think this series has really resonated and connected beyond anything really that we'd ever imagined. And I'm sure this kind of constant state of flux is a big contributory factor towards that. Fortunately, we've got our esteemed panel today to help us work through all of that and figure a clear path out of it. But for those who don't know, my name is Luke Southall and I'm Managing Director at Oaks. And we work with sport development organisations across the world, supporting with strategy, fundraising, sustainability, and capacity building. And I'll be the moderator for today's discussion as always. So in January, we launched our 3rd annual State of the Sector report, the results of which form not just the basis of today's discussion, but the whole series that we've planned for the rest of the year. For those who haven't seen it, so by way of a brief recap, the findings presented quite a generally positive and encouraging picture. So there's a marked upturn in both fundraising performance and significantly confidence compared to the previous year. Some key stats: 64% of organisations that we spoke to were forecasting an increase in income based on the previous year. Over half of those that we spoke to either exceeded or at least matched their previous year's performance as well. And I think really positively, as I said, 78% of the sector is confident in its ability to increase future fundraising revenues. That's always a key marker we look out for. The confidence is high amongst those we spoke to. As ever, though, there's plenty of reasons to be circumspect. Some of the areas that represented cause for concern for us were a quarter of the respondents that we spoke to relying on a single donor for more than 50% of their income, and an additional 25% relying on one single donor for between a quarter and a half of their income as well. So quite a big proportion still. And still concerningly, fundraising strategy development and building relationships and networks were the top 2 areas that were identified as needing additional support, which is an ongoing trend from the previous 2 years of our research as well. So with all that in mind, I think the focus of today's session will be really exploring the primary factors that are influencing fundraising performance at the moment and how we can kind of look forward into the year ahead. So we'll cover some of the key takeaways and findings from the report, some specific fundraising areas and how we can make the most out of them within our organisations, how we can utilise every tool at our disposal to support our fundraising efforts, and then to think about what we need to do to ready ourselves for future changes in the fundraising landscape and whatever the year ahead holds for us. And you've seen their faces already, but what panel of speakers we have to help us work through it all. Some new, some returning faces as well. We're so thrilled to have such fantastic guests today. So before we go any further, let's introduce them, and I'll hand over to them to introduce themselves. So, Sally, welcome. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Luke, and thanks for that setup. Good morning, everyone. Those of us who are based on the East Coast in the United States. I'm Southall Nnamani, and I'm the co-executive director of PeacePlayers United States. For those of you who might not be familiar with who we are and what we do, our mission is centered around using sport, particularly the game of basketball, to increase equitable opportunities for young people, to bridge divides, and to really develop young people as leaders in their communities. We work in 5 major cities in Brooklyn, Baltimore, LA, Detroit, and Chicago. I'm really excited about this because I come mainly from a programmatic background and just recently stepped fully into the fundraising space. And so I come to fundraising very much with a community building mindset. And I'm looking forward to sharing that perspective with you all.
Right. Thank you, Sally. Really great to have you here. Nicole.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. Thanks so much for inviting me here. I'm really excited to be a part of this. Yeah, my name is Nicole Matuska. I'm the Girls Brand Director at Women Win. So Women Win we work through kind of 3 main initiatives. We're a global multidimensional women's fund that sees a future where every woman and girl exercises their rights. And through our different initiatives, we kind of approach that vision. So the girls brand is really the one that focuses on our sport and women's right and gender justice work. We've got Win-Win Strategies that looks at economic resilience in adolescent girls and young women. And then Ignita, which really looks at philanthropy, ecosystems, and getting money into shrinking civic spaces around the world. So I've been working at Women Win since over 11 years now, and have worn many hats, and have the pleasure of now leading on our portfolio of girls work, which includes a lot of fundraising, influence, resource mobilization for the brand. So really excited to be here, and I'm looking forward to joining the conversation.
Great, us too. Thanks, Nicole. David, welcome back.
Thank you for having me back. Thanks for having me. Look, I'm really excited about today. Really happy to be sharing this space with Nicole and Sally. Really looking forward to the conversation. My name is David Given Sjölander, and I work as a consultant and strategic advisor for a number of organizations at the moment. Beyond Sport being one of them, Oaks, the Swedish Postcode Foundation, and the United Nations. And previously, I've worked at the Swedish Postcode Foundation for the last 7 years or so, developing their sport for social change strategy, and I'm managing the portfolio of the organization. And this is a space I've been in for the last 15 odd years, is the sport for development space. So I'm a bit of a geek in this space. So really looking forward to this conversation.
Brilliant. Thank you all. Yeah, really, really excited as well about getting stuck in and hearing all your views on all the kind of range of topics we're looking to cover. So just before we start, obviously, as always, want to say a huge thank you to our series partners, that's our Laureate Sport for Good Foundation, Common Goal, Sport Dev, and Tafita, for their continued and amazing support. And again, find a bit of housekeeping. I'm sure there'll be an endless supply of questions, so please get them into the Q&A box, and I'll try and get as many as possible to the panelists as we go. Right, let's get started. So I think, Sally, I'll come to you first, and I think that's the first area to explore for me, just looking at some of the more general kind of findings linked to kind of our report, but also just the state of things at the moment, state of the sector on the ground. So you heard some of the kind of key takeaways that I kind of talked about at the top there. Just wanted to kind of get a sense from your perspective how that resonates or doesn't in terms of how it feels on the ground from your perspective, and how you're kind of seeing the lay of the land at the moment.
Yeah, I would say the last couple of years obviously has been a challenge for the sport for development space, from one navigating the pandemic and going right into a financial crisis. And then we have the Ukraine war kind of looming over our heads. And we've seen how that has significantly affected how foundations and individuals are making investments. Well, what I would say is that there is the sport for development sector, there is like this passionate group of people who really believe in their mission. I think storytelling and just sharing out the stories of impact of what we've been able to accomplish over the years is really central to what we're able to make happen. I would say there are a number of corporates who are leaning more into the role that sport can play in achieving social and health outcomes. And I think the more we're innovative and the more we're intentional about how we engage in these diverse groups, and really identifying groups and organizations who share that passion and that belief in the role that sport can play, I think is critical as we come out of the pandemic and kind of navigate this new space. I would say PeacePlayers US is part of a global network. And my contribution to the conversation today would really be centered on PeacePlayers United States and how we are approaching fundraising. We're very intentional about engaging partners who want to walk this walk in the long term. We've had donors or potential donors approaches and want to adopt, I'm not a fan of that language, adopt one of our programs and fund it in the short term. And that is just not an alley that we want to walk. We want to be with people who are thinking about this from a community standpoint and also from a partnership standpoint. We know there is a power imbalance in the fundraising space between those who have the resources and the organizations who are doing the work on the ground. And we would much rather align ourselves with organizations and foundations who are invested in this, who recognize that power imbalance and want to create a space where the organizations that they support are part of informing the decision making on how dollars are spent. So I would say it's a challenging time at the moment. However, I think there are quite some opportunities on the horizon, particularly in the United States, that we're looking forward to tapping into.
Well, thank you, Sally. That's fascinating, and it's really hard, and it's always interesting to hear when organizations are kind of resilient in that respect when it comes to those funders who are looking at something short term, and being able to say no is quite difficult sometimes, isn't it? Particularly when things are so difficult out there. If there's a funder who's looking to give a contribution, it can be hard to say no and stay true to that kind of spirit. So yeah, be interested to tap into that a bit more as we go on. But Nicole, it'd be great to kind of get the same kind of question, really, just from your perspective. How does it feel out there, and how's your experience of things over the last year or so?
Yeah, thanks so much. I think just echoing actually a lot of what Sally said, our sort of main goals in the past year or so has really been to kind of work. So, I mean, and I'm also speaking as a funder. So the Girls Brand and Women Win is a funder in the space, but also receiving funding and looking for funding ourselves. I think we really have been trying to be more targeted towards working with funders, but also being a funder that is providing flexible, unrestricted multi-year grants to organizations and truly kind of supporting the work defined by the term, defined by the people on the ground in our partnerships with those grassroots organizations, as well as influencing other funders to kind of do the same. So really embracing a more decolonized feminist way of being, which, as Sally kind of mentioned these points, but it's kind of unrestricted funding, a decolonized approach to reporting and gathering data and mail on that funding, and really just trusting partners that they know the best way to use that funding and how to use it on the ground to create impact, and then having them define what that impact means and what success means. So we, and this has been hard. It's really hard to work in these ways. We've learned also that it just takes a lot more work to do these types of structures and approaches and processes. They're different than more traditional ways of funding in terms of your operations, in terms of how you collect data. And so, yeah, we've been really trying, just to evolve internally, as well as have more conversations to try to influence in that space to move in that direction. It's more sustainable, it's more long-term, and having to say no sometimes to those one-off funding opportunities, as you mentioned, Sally, that just aren't aligned with how we want to approach partnerships has been really key as well. And that's hard too when you need funding. So
yeah, no, absolutely. And David, we were joking before we started about your kind of diverse perspective at the moment. It'd be great to get your take on it. For obviously, you've got a take from a funding side as well, from a delivery organization perspective. So yeah, how do you kind of see it?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both Sally and Nicole. And I also love the work that Women Win is doing with the on-site fund and reaching those hyper-local organizations and giving over decision-making to the community organizations. I think that's a model that needs to continually be developed and reach other funders in the space. But looking at the report, I think we can't turn a blind eye to the fact that the sector is very reliant on grant funding, and that organizations on an individual level are very reliant on one funder for 50% or between 25 to 50%. If you look at the stats, it's 50% of the sector that we've responded are reliant for between 25% to 50% plus of their funding. And that's a risk for organizations, but it's also a risk for the sector. And I think looking at kind of the organizations that are doing well in this space, again, I would turn to my two fellow panelists, and they transcend this sport for development sector. They're not sport organizations, they're development organizations. And I think looking into the future, that's the opportunity. Even if there's a heavy reliance on grants, there's still a lot of grant opportunities that this sector has not tapped into. And that's because we have, for lack of a better phrase, a branding issue. We brand ourselves as sports organizations, and we do ourselves a discredit. And I think the organizations that are doing well in this space are the ones who are putting the development agenda first and backing it up with the methodology rather than leading with the methodology. And I think you see that in some of the fundraising that's happening. Those that are doing it well and are reaching those non-traditional sports funders, they're the ones who are talking development issues first and then coming in with the method that they're using to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a constant theme that keeps coming up in these discussions, actually, around the kind of positioning and obviously the storytelling, which we'll come on to as well. And David, keen to just understand a bit more what you say about the untapped potential from fund in terms of where we could be getting much more funding in terms of the types of areas that should be being looked at. Anything specific there, or anything you've got in mind where you think actually there's a real avenue that's not being explored sufficiently across the sector?
Well, I mean, if you look at the kind of traditional donors in the space, you can start rattling off some of the common ones. You've got the Comic Relief in the last couple of years. You have the Postcode Foundation in Sweden. You have Erasmus Plus Sport, which is obviously very much for sport in the EU context. But even within the EU, the European funding, they fund a lot more that sports-based organizations or organizations in this space could tap into. But because of the definition of the sport organizations, they only view it as Erasmus Plus Sport as being the one that's for them. You have the Oaks Foundation, Ford Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. These all have health, education, youth development priorities. They don't specifically have a sports focus, but neither do the organizations that are part of this conversation. They're working on gender equality, youth development, education, health. The methodology is a sports-based methodology. And I think that's where the kind of, there's a miscommunication, or there's a miss there in that space, because these are potential donors for the sector if we're able to communicate that and kind of market and brand ourselves in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And Sally, something that I think that came through in your kind of first response and intro, I got a sense of the optimism from you as well. And you were talking about actually that there's lots of opportunities out there, and you can see that. And that came through in their report as well, in terms of high confidence levels across the sector. Is that something that's just kind of trademark resilience and optimism of people who work in this space, or do you kind of see that there's some kind of clear opportunities out there that we should be tapping into, or that are on the horizon for the sector?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a bit of both, right? I think we are an eternal optimists. And at the same time, I also think we haven't, David's right, like we haven't really scratched the surface in terms of like the funding avenues are available to the sport for development space. We are a sector that's relatively young compared to a lot of the other areas of this international development world in general. And while sport, I think over the last 20 plus years since the sport for development sector kind of emerged, there's even a greater case on the value and the role of sport from academia, from even PeacePlayers. Like we recently put out an 8-year RCT study that really followed some of our young people, about 100 young people who are part of our Middle East program, to gauge how their opinions, their attitudes, their perceptions change over the course of time. So our work in the Middle East, we work in Israel and the West Bank, using the game of basketball to bridge divides between the Palestinian and Israeli young people. We are the only integrated basketball team and competing in the AAU, for those of you who are in the States. The AAU, or the national kind of like league for youth sports. And not only are we competing in that space, those young people are really good basketball players. And so not only are they, winning together, they're building relationships across these divides. Their parents' perceptions of the other side is changing. And the RCT found that the longer we engage young people or the longer young people were involved in PeacePlayers program, the more likely they were to change their perception of the other side. 96% of young people felt like they can invite someone from the other side to their home. In a country where they're living in active conflict, like that is real. Like this is impact that you can't, it's very rare to find in other spaces other than sport. Like we all know the role on how sports creates, that avenue for relationships to develop, and not only that as well, but leadership skills to develop, and for young people to feel this sense of like responsibility to lead in their communities. So I mentioned that because, sports sometimes have a sport for development. We've had like this stigma of like there isn't enough like evidence-based research really showing the value of the work, but more and more over the last 20 years, like you're seeing, for example, RCT and more academics in the space really making the case. And like for women, when I've seen a number of like toolkits and resources that are put out that demonstrates the impact that sport development programs are having within these different areas, from gender inequality to socioeconomic and inequality in general. So I say that to say that we haven't really scratched the surface. I think there's a new generation of young people, millennials, Gen Z, who are very curious about what's happening around them and who want to support organizations who are doing great work. And so while we've traditionally prioritized the corporates and the grants, I think there is an emerging group of young donors who are curious about the world around them, who we can think about how we engage, be it through social media or other avenues. So yes, my optimism is real in the sense of like, I feel like we're just beginning to scratch the surface in the space.
Fabulous, yeah. Thanks, Sally. And then first audience question of the day. I always forget to check these, but so one's come in, I think it's quite timely. Nicole, I'll bring it to you. I think it kind of links a little bit to what Sally was talking about as well. So the question is, how can data and analytics support fundraising efforts and donor mapping? So I think really relevant question in terms of obviously the kind of how important that is to underpin fundraising. It'd be good to know as well how that feeds into your own kind of fundraising planning when you're looking at this as well in the organization.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. I think it really does kind of build off of what Sally and David were saying a bit, in the sense that, you know, data analytics and kind of this learning that we get from some of these programs and projects that we invest in really can speak to that intersectionality of themes that sport and the methodology of sport can address in, you know, development issues, gender equity, mental health and well-being, you know, whatever it is, whatever the kind of thematic approach that you're trying to address in your community, conflict resolution, or the intersection of a lot of those, having that data and those reports and the learnings from the ground on those themes really does allow us to access a lot of funding that probably we could have never accessed before if we just kind of went sport first, right? And so I think understanding, you know, what kind of spaces and sectors do we want to access funding from, or the intersection of those spaces, and then how can we use that data to really support sport as a methodology to address mental health in the UK, or, you know, sexual and reproductive health and rights in, you know, South Africa, like whatever, you know, that is that you're interested in. I think getting the right type of data from your programs and projects and you know, obviously that takes investment and resources. As Sally said, I'm sure a randomized control trial is not cheap, but if we can invest also as funders in those approaches to support organizations to get that data based on what they define as how they want to be successful, and then support them in putting that back out in the sector so that everyone can kind of use that data to show that, you know, sport and the methodology of sport can be successful. I think that's really important too. You know, maybe some organizations do have more resources to do that type of deep research and impact evaluations, and making that accessible to everyone to support the fundraising collectively, I think is really important here. So. Yeah,
absolutely. Great. Thanks for that. And then this kind of leads me, I suppose, into the next area, which again was something that came up prominently in the report and in last year's work that we did as well, around kind of strategy and planning, and that there's perhaps some organizations struggle to know where to start, or don't necessarily have the skills or experience to think about a fundraising plan and income diversification, all the things that we like to talk about. So yeah, I think Sally, I'll come to you on that to start with, just from your perspective when you're looking at this with PeacePlayers US. How do you go about that process? Is there a kind of plan that looks at 12 months, 3 years, beyond? Kind of how do you tackle that when you're looking at your planning for the year ahead?
Yeah, that is a great question. As you know, so many of us in this space are just our capacity is very limited.
Yeah.
And so being able to plan ahead, I think, is definitely an area where I think our organization could be stronger. If you even think about like PeacePlayers US, like we started in 2017, you know, COVID happened at the start of 2020. So while we are 5 years old, we're technically about 2.5 years old. And we've been privileged to have a seed funder who has really walked the walk with us and has been very much involved in collaborating with us and how we network map and identify other, you know, organizations who are in alignment with how we approach our work. And so last year, I would say, like, we worked really hard in fundraising. I can't say with full confidence that we worked really smart. So in the last couple of months, we've been really building in systems that will allow us to properly prospect, to map out our networks. We are currently in the process of solidifying our first board of directors for our US entity. So we know that with having that group and having those ambassadors and champions on our board, we're able to unlock like new opportunities. So I will be very frank and honest and say, like, this is certainly an area that we can get better. And we've started developing those systems to position us to be more strategic in how we're working in fundraising and how we are preparing ahead. That way we're not just kind of like in the rat race of just pursuing the next dollar.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the candor on that side, because that often those things we're thinking about the systems, the processes, the underlying components, they're the bits that can seem less direct, and actually let's just focus on the next application or trying to find the next corporate funder. And it's sometimes those things that will ultimately be the things that are key for the longer term sustainability that we've already talked about. And David, from your perspective, obviously when you've had obviously the funder perspective and then working with organizations directly as well, you must have saw a lot of that. And I know some of the work you've been doing in Sweden, specifically focusing on building this kind of the capacity and infrastructure to help organizations. Yeah, what are the things you've seen that are fundamental to underpin the strategic plan around fundraising that perhaps still we think we need work on collectively to support the fundraising ultimately?
Yeah, I think that, well, I mean, you're talking to someone who has strategic advisor in their title, so I'm obviously biased and you have to have a strategy, but I think we can overcomplicate it at times. When we think about a strategy, we almost think that this is this long document. It's going to take time to develop, and it can also just be a simple 2-page document that gives you a roadmap on how you're going to go about these things. Like, what do we need to get in place? And becomes almost like a checklist for, do I have the systems in place? Do I have a database with potential donors in place? Okay, I need to get that in place. And you can simplify the process. It doesn't have to be overly complicated. And I think when you speak about networks, I think that's something that comes up in the report as well. And I think networks are going to play a really important role. And Nicole, I completely agree with what you're saying, is that these more advanced monitoring or evaluation and learning processes like randomized controlled trials, they cost a lot. But we have, over the last 20 years, there are some networks out there that have built up the capacity to be able to do these things, to then push it back out into the sector, to support that branding of the sector towards those non-traditional sports organizations. So I think when it comes to the whole role of networks, I think that is one area that they can massively help organizations that are part of their network to do this positioning, but also with the strategy around how then do you use that? Because it's one thing to have a piece of data or a report, but how then can you use that to inform your fundraising? And ultimately as well, I think we talk about a fundraising strategy. These things shouldn't be in silos. Your program design links into your communications, links into your fundraising. And all too often, these 3 parts of your organization work in silos of one another. And you're a program person, you don't understand the communication, so you don't understand why that's important. Or you're programming, but don't work with fundraising. Fundraising doesn't understand the programming. I think those 3 areas overlap perfectly, which gives you the fundraising. You can't do fundraising without good data collection and monitoring, evaluation, and learning, because you don't have any stories, data-driven storytelling to be able to do your fundraising. It's the same with your communication. So I think it's about simplifying this whole idea of strategy and just looking at, okay, what's the next feasible step for my organization? Where am I? Where do I want to be? And what's that first step on that road?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Nicole, it'd be great to hear on David's point, because I totally agree around how fundraising fits in within the wider organization. And when we talk about fundraising strategy, absolutely does not exist in isolation, or it shouldn't. So how does that work at Women Win in terms of how the kind of different teams all kind of collaborate and how the things have that direct impact on each other? How does that land at Women Win?
Yeah, it's such an important point. And I think it's something we've been conscious of as part of our strategy, and I think doing a little bit better, like internally, to kind of have those overlapping roles and responsibilities between programs, teams, people leading, strategy, as well as then people leading our sort of influence work. And what really helps is when you're able to, I think, shift people around in different roles. So I guess just at Women Win, we've never been really successful in hiring pure fundraisers. It just has never worked out well for us. Our best fundraisers and resource mobilizers have always been our program staff and people who have been at the organization, understand the work on the ground. And so that's kind of how we've approached our way of doing this, is we really create small teams of people from programs teams, from our leadership team, who have deep experience in our programmatic work over the years to actually lead some of our influence and fundraising opportunities. And that actually helps us combine those two things, David, or those multiple layers of and lenses around fundraising, is understanding what are we actually fundraising for, what is our programmatic strategy and our strategic vision for the organization, and ensuring that the fundraising then matches to that, as opposed to us being led by any sort of fundraising strategy, right? The fundraising strategy really is in the support of our programmatic and organizational strategy. So, you know, ensuring those things are aligned then also just aligns with how we're resourced and staffed as an organization. You know, we've been in a position in the past where we've kind of fundraised really successfully for certain things, but realized that actually was a bit outside of our programmatic strategy, and we didn't have the right staff or team to run that line of work that we were doing all this amazing fundraising for. So I think it just, trickles down to also like your staff, like what you're staffed to do and the skills and capacities on your staff to run your programs, and ensuring all of that is aligned. And so, like I said, the way we approach that is really creating small teams from our different programs, from our different pillars of work, as well as our operations. I mean, we consider our operations team a part of our programs just because a lot of the work we're doing in different brands, like the On-Side Fund that David mentioned, is actually the finance team plays a huge role in being part of this women's fund, right? So we ensure, that there's weekly meetings with programs and the influence team, and that we do this as a collective team. We don't really have someone who is in charge of only fundraising. It's kind of a blended model. So
Luke, I'd love to add to that. I think Nicole is spot on in terms of like building those committees that involve people from different functions. I think where we've thrived at PeacePlayers is that majority of our senior leadership now and previously were folks who either worked as international fellows in one of our international sites, who had seen the program on the ground and led the program on the ground, and then they then joined our back office and supporting our various functions. So they understand the impact from the ground perspective. And then while there is this, I did see in the report, this kind of like observation that there is like the skills gap within the sport for development space around fundraising. And I've been around like super skilled fundraisers, and most times like their language is very, it doesn't connect with the average person who is just curious about like what impact your program is having. And so what I would like to say is, one of the strategies that's also worked really well for us is every year we host a partner summit. We don't really consider our funder, we consider them partners. And we invite them to be a part of to be a part of that summit, where we're able to share out like, here's what we're working on. Here are some of the pain points. Here are some opportunities that we see coming up. What are some ways that you all are thinking about impact from this? For example, one of the questions that came up for us in our last summit was, we have a mission, we know what our mission is. However, there are some of these key challenges that are deep-rooted in systemic inequity that affects our young people's ability to lead in their communities. For example, education, the quality of housing, the access to quality food. A lot of the neighborhoods where many of our young people live are food deserts. So these are not areas that we focus. However, these challenges are affecting how we're able to accomplish how we're able to really lean into our vision and support our young people in their leadership journey. So we brought our partners together to think through like, well, how can we begin solving for some of these challenges in a way that we stay mission focused. And now we're building like this ecosystem around our vision, and also these inequities and challenges that are affecting our ability to really accomplish our mission in the neighborhoods where we work. And it really creates a space for like real meaningful conversation, and for our partners and funders to understand how we're thinking about the work. And we also have some of our local, like hyper local grassroots partners in those conversations. So that power and balance I talked about earlier, we're able to kind of begin to level it, where we can be in a room with a Nike, Nike's our seed fund in the US, with a Nike executive and a community organizer, and we're sharing diverse perspectives, and they're able to really understand the challenges that our organization is looking to solve, not just hearing it from me, but also hearing it from people who are directly affected by it on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something just to tie this up from what you've both said there is about having like a culture of fundraising across the organization as well. So tying it together to achieve that, it has to be kind of from the top down all the way through. The kind of everybody has a part to play within that, and it needs to be really embedded. And also, no matter what size organization you are, if you can engender that culture of fundraising, then that will be a huge benefit to any fundraising strategy and approach that we take. I'm conscious of time flying past us, so another audience question, and Nicole, it's for you again. So it's about corporate fundraising, corporate partners. So the question is, what is your approach to securing new corporate partners? And obviously that's something that's kind of part of the DNA of Women Win in terms of your relationship with the private sector organizations and how that works. So yeah, I guess opening up a little bit more generally, just to what advice would you be able to give in terms of how to engage corporate partners, which is something that is always kind of high on the agenda when people are looking at fundraising in the sector?
Yeah, I think corporate partners have always been kind of a cornerstone of our fundraising strategy. I would say at Women Win, we, very much have cultivated those relationships and partnerships from the beginning in our work. And, I think it's been a journey, and I think corporate partners, depending on the sector, have also been through kind of a bit of a journey in the past couple of years of kind of understanding and learning how to best support this space in this sector. And for us, it's really about building relationships, I think, with the right people in a corporation, in a business, at an organization, right? So creating direct connections and relationships with, the right people. It's treating corporates as a partnership. So not, I think a lot of times nonprofits might come in and just see corporates as big ATM machines that provide a lot of money and maybe don't want too much in return, apart from like fancy, shiny PR materials for their corporate social responsibility newsletter or socials. And I think for us, it's really finding the corporates who are interested in more of a transformative partnership that truly works for both partners and allows Women Win to do the work that we do, which also supports the strategic objectives of that corporation and their social impact strategy and vision and mission, right? So it's finding the corporates that are kind of mission aligned, vision aligned in that sense, creating that more transformative partnership. So really understanding how can we help serve their strategy and how can they help serve our strategy, and making sure those two things are aligned. I think if one of those are off, then it does become a bit transactional and short term. And yeah, we're really trying to look for more longer term partnerships with corporates. So yeah, I think that's the big one too. And then, yeah, just really understanding, what it is they are interested in supporting and needing from the relationship as well. And have, of course, communications is always important. So having, supporting them to make also the case internally, right? Not only externally with their communications, but oftentimes you find a champion within a company who really loves your work. But in order to get that funding and unlock the funding from different places, because often too, businesses or, corporations have funding in different, whether it's in marketing or the brand team or the social impact team, there's like different pockets of funding in different places. So having that champion, supporting them with the assets and resources and language to make the case for you and your work in those different places that often aren't talking to each other or not a lot, or not working together. I think that also unlocks more possibilities within that company and corporation, and creating kind of strategic connections across the different departments. So that's sort of been our strategy, and we have some really wonderful corporate partners and wonderful champions within those partners that really fight for us and fight for funding for our work internally. So.
Real, thanks, Nicole. And Sally, I guess it'd be great to get your take on that as well. As obviously, PeacePlayers is similarly kind of connected with corporate partners as well.
Yeah, Luke, can you please remind me the question I might have? I just want to make sure I'm answering correctly.
Yeah, sure. It was just about how you approach the corporate partnerships and building those relationships, and yeah, any kind of general advice in terms of perhaps where to start particularly thinking about some of the smaller organizations who might be looking at this thinking it's a new area we want to explore, we're not quite sure how to go about it?
Yes, I think the long-term investment is really critical for this. I also recognize that, you know, there are small nonprofits who are maybe just starting out and just starting to build up their programs and their visibility. And so it takes a while for, like, a large corporate might, you know, feel that it's a big risk to invest in a smaller nonprofit that hasn't been around for some time. So I recognize, like, that pushing for long-term investment, and also being realistic in terms of, like, how long it takes to build a relationship with a corporate and how long it takes to get a large dollar investment is a challenge, and it takes a bit of relationship building, it takes a bit of trust building as well. What I would say is, you know, to Nicole's point, that there are different departments within within a corporate organization, from the brand teams to the social impact arm to the communications arm to even, like, the young professional network within an organization. Like, there are different groups that you can begin engaging with. For example, like, there is a potential corporate partner that we're currently cultivating a relationship with. And it's like, while my goal is a long-term investment, I'm just recently connected with their young professionals network, and their young recent grads who just started at their first job. They're very excited about having opportunities to give back, and being able to build trust with that group. And to Nicole's point, really having them connected to your work and having them serve as champions and ambassadors of your work internally can eventually lead to, like, that long-term investment. So I see it as a journey that will take a bit of time in building trust and building those relationships to get to, like, that large dollar investment, which is what we ultimately want.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Another audience question, David, this is coming your way this time. So some of the most important SVD programs for communities are often small, grassroots, or sometimes even informal groups. As these organizations look to grow, where can they access kind of seed funding? So the question continues, these are the groups who have kind of the most barriers to accessing even small amounts of funding for basic essential costs. So yeah, any kind of ideas or suggestions on where to start when people are just starting out with something that's a good concept and perhaps looking for something to get them off the ground?
Yeah, and I think it's such a prominent question for so many organizations in this space, which is heavily grassroots organizations and heavily volunteer driven as well. And I think it's about looking locally at what opportunities exist. I think if you're a small grassroots organization, to start looking at these international opportunities, I mean, that's not where your funding is going to be at. You need to kind of look at what opportunities are there locally. How can you engage with individual donors? How do you get community? As Sally said earlier, there's a generation of young people now who are engaged in social issues, maybe to a greater extent than other generations or previous generations, and they want to fund good work. They want to support local projects. They want to support projects they believe in, and also projects that they're able to engage in. And I think starting, if you are a local organization, starting with your fundraising locally is going to be the way that you're going to start building that up, while at the same time building up the evidence and your data-driven storytelling. And a lot of that is going to be anecdotal storytelling at the beginning, but you've got to build up that evidence base as well to be able to communicate what you're doing, to start slowly but surely accessing the bigger grants. Look to the networks. Again, it was something that was talked about in the report, but identify the networks that you can align yourself with, reach out to, and get support by joining those networks to, again, build out your capacity to do the fundraising, to do the communications, to do the monitoring, evaluation, and learning. I think there's always this idea when you start a new organization or a new project, you see a Women Win, or you see a PeacePlayers, and you see what they're doing. You're like, how can I get seed funding from Nike? And I think it's about being realistic about where your opportunities as a new organization lie, starting locally with what is available around you, and slowly but surely building up that long-term aim to be able to get that larger grant or that larger corporate sponsor, or building out your individual donor. So I think that would be where I would start, is identifying the opportunities that exist locally to you and really tapping into those.
Yeah, great. Thanks, David. Really helpful. So I just want to turn the lens around momentarily onto the funders, and it's something that you mentioned earlier, Nicole, around how actually from the grant makers and so many of the so much of the funding in the sector comes from institutions and trust and foundation grant funders. What do you think they can be doing more of to support the organisations who are looking to apply? And we're talking again about the limited resources across the board. What can and should the funders be doing differently to better support the S4D organisations who are looking at them?
Yeah, I think that's a great question as well. I think, we do talk a lot and put a lot of the responsibility on these small grassroots organizations to build up their skills, to hire the right people, to, do all this work. And I think as funders ourselves, and as, and the funders in the sector, really looking at ourselves and what can we do to decrease the barriers for these organizations to get the funding, right? And I think with our with some of our fund work at Women Win, so through the Onside Fund specifically within the Girls brand, that was sort of our attempt, was really looking at what is the process for accessing this money and how can we decrease those barriers. One being ensuring that we have calls for applications in different languages and can actually field and read the applications in those languages, because oftentimes these small grassroots organizations don't have native English speakers on their staff, and a lot of these grant opportunities require an application in English, and that is a huge barrier. And then also writing an application when it's not your native language, you're not going to come off as strong as someone who's fluent and can deliver a beautifully written application, right? So it's understanding those dynamics. It's understanding that a lot of organizations that do this really important grassroots work are tiny and often sometimes can't register as an organization or nonprofit in a country because of the type of work they do. Maybe it's illegal to be doing that work when you're working really at that justice, social justice space. And for us, obviously, it's looking at gender justice. These organizations are sometimes doing really risky work that maybe is illegal in certain countries and their legal frameworks, and they oftentimes really struggle to access funding. So, also thinking about ourselves as funders, and this is hard. Not every funder, I think, can do this, but can we start funding organizations that are maybe more collectives or individuals doing really activist work that aren't necessarily registered legally, right? And then just I think the reporting and mail processes for a lot of the grants that go out can be more learn focused and decolonized. I think sometimes those processes are so arduous for staff, of organizations that are tiny, that have, don't even have a dedicated mail person, monitoring, evaluation, and learning person. And so really understanding how we can report back what's happening and the impact that's happening, but make that in a way that serves the community of grantees, the sector in general, and not just a one-way street of us extracting data for the sake of understanding the impact, right? So how can that serve the whole sector? So I think those are, I think it's understanding as a funder what our role and relationship is, and ensuring that we're supporting in the best way possible and unlocking the funding to as many organizations and people as possible.
Great. David, I see you kind of very, very actively agreeing, I think, with a lot of what Nicole said there. And obviously from your background, is that something of you would share in terms of what more we can be doing from a funding side of things?
Yeah, 100% agree with everything Nicole said. And I think, again, that shows the power of the networks within the sector as well, to play that in between, because for a lot of some of the international, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is a very set in its way structure. They have a way of funding, whereas an organization like a Women Win, or like a PeacePlayers International, or Common Goal, or Beyond Sport, that kind of in between is able to do that model really well, and able to be that go-between between these funding opportunities that exist that aren't maybe as accessible to the hyper-local grassroots organizations. And I think the onside model, I said at the right beginning, it's an incredible model of how you can democratize philanthropy. And I think it's one that other funders in that space and that kind of network role in this sport for development space should also be looking at how can they adapt a similar approach. So I completely agree. And I think it's also it's a challenge for some of these. So if you think of Comic Relief, or you think of the Swedish Post Corps, you think of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, there is accountability that they have built into the systems, and they for different legal structures in their own countries, given where their funding comes from, they have to report back on those legal structures. And I think that's again where the networks in the sports for development space they play such an important role in terms of accessing that funding and then redistributing it in a democratized way and in a grassroots community focused way to ensure that the funding reaches the organizations who are doing this work on the ground, and removing those barriers and always becoming a buffer between those reporting requirements, those auto reporting requirements, and all of those things that are built into some of these funding streams. Those network organizations can become a buffer, but ensure that the funding still reaches the grassroots organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant, thank you.
And just to build off that super quick. No, I just wanted to add, Swedish Postcode Lottery has been part of, the onside fund in the past. And I think the pooled funding mechanism here too, David, really supports that as well, and helps, I think, us reach more grassroots organizations versus, working with donors on separate kind of projects and programs. So, the onside fund that we were referring to is a pooled funding mechanism, bringing in funding from a lot of different foundations, corporates, individuals into one pooled fund that then distributes that out to different grantees. And I think that just leverages the investment from different donors, from different funders, to reach some of these grassroots groups that they themselves would not have had the opportunity to do directly, as David said, because of their frameworks and needs for reporting and due diligence and whatnot. So I think too, like looking at, and I know some of the other kind of in between kind of alliance organizations like Common Goal, like Beyond Sport are doing this as well, but bringing in, different funders, putting all that money together and seeing the impact we can have in spaces that we couldn't have done as individual funders is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant, thank you. There's only 8 minutes to go. So Sally, I'll come to you. Something I really wanted to touch on, and it has been kind of mentioned a few times throughout various parts of the discussion, but is that importance of storytelling. And I think it's clearly something that it's always resonated with me, how effectively PeacePlayers kind of build that into everything that you do, in terms of really having that clarity of the stories that you can tell around the impact that's being had for beneficiaries. So yeah, I just wondered how important that is to fundraising when you're looking at it from a PeacePlayers US perspective, and yeah, any advice that we can share in terms of being able to pull that out for every organization, no matter how big or small, how you can kind of find your own story and bring that out to support fundraising.
Yeah, absolutely. I think David mentioned this at the start about just the branding and our brand. Most sport for development organizations kind of struggle with branding and being specific about what it is that we're trying to accomplish. And when we first started in the US, like our work traditionally in post-conflict and conflicts and societies in conflict has always been centered around like this two groups, and using sport to bring these two groups together. And I think the work in the US really challenged us to recognize like the nuances and the complexities in the places where we work. Like, for example, I lived and worked in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and we'd always talk about like the mission there as like Catholic and Protestant divide. However, there are like African refugees and South Asian immigrants that live in Northern Ireland, and how our mission was in some ways excluding those groups who are living in that country. And so the work in the US really challenged us to think about, one, the complexities and the nuances of the communities where we work, and be very intentional about simplifying what our message is. So whenever you meet anyone who works at PeacePlayers in the US and they ask you, what do we do? Like, it's centered around like, we use the game of basketball to increase equitable opportunities and to develop young people as leaders who will transform and advocate for their communities. Like, those are the two main items that we are trying to accomplish. So being very intentional and simplified in our messaging, I think, is important. And then let your stories just keep hitting on what your key points are. So for example, each year we put out a storybook, a PeacePlayers US storybook. And it sounds very almost childish in some ways, but it's our way of really pulling stories from the ground, from our young people, parents, local partners, and really talking about the impact, not necessarily from a data-driven place, but from a place of how the organization and the work that we do is transforming the communities on the ground. Folks hear from me all the time and hear from our city directors on the work that we do and the goosebump moments that happen in our programs. But it's another thing to hear it from the voice of a young person or from the voice of a parent, and to have like images that go along with that storybook. So I think storytelling is really central to this. Having been a coach, having worked on the ground for a number of years, like I know the value of sport, even as a young person who played sports, but not everyone knows that. Yeah. And we have to be able to tell a compelling story that is tied back to your mission. And then the last thing I would say is just consider who you're talking to, right? We have like, there are different stories for different audiences, and be creative in how you share your stories based on who your audience is, and really sharing stories that would resonate with the person or the group that you're speaking with.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Sally. Just quickly before we come into final thoughts, Nicole, from Women Win perspective, sometimes some of the stories aren't always that, I'm guessing, always that easy to tell, or that, you know, there might be some nuance in terms of the impact, and it can be not always as straightforward in terms of some of the storytelling mechanisms. Like, how do you go about some of those more involved stories? How does that come into it from your perspective?
Yeah, no, it's true. I you know, a lot of it's hard to kind of capture and distill things in nice sound bites or a nice short video for a lot of this work. And so I think, yeah, with us, it's really trying to amplify the voices, I think, of the grantees and the program partners, implementing partners that we work with, the people on the ground, through, yeah, different types of methodologies. We use a lot of digital storytelling that you know, provides the space and the facilitated space for individuals to tell their own stories of the change that sport or the work is having in their lives and their communities. I think it's supporting our partners to write thought pieces on different platforms, as opposed to Women Win always doing it. It's trying to get more of our partners and the people we work with on panels to represent the work they're doing, as opposed to us talking about it. You know, I think it's just trying to, as much as we can, step back a bit and put those partners front and center. They'll always be able to tell the story better than we can, hands down, and supporting them to just find those spaces to tell it, to put them in those positions to tell it when we can, and use that privilege that we have to do so. So yeah, from our perspective, it is really nuanced, and I think hearing about it from the partners and from the people on the ground is the best way to do that, and finding as many avenues to do that as well. So
brilliant. Thanks, Nicole. So I'm going to apologize again to all the audience members whose questions I didn't manage to get to the panel, and there's so many more questions I had here that we didn't get to, but thank you all for your contributions there so far. So just before we kind of wrap up, it'd be great to kind of get your respective final thoughts and kind of closing messages. David, I'll come to you first, if I may.
Yeah, I think, like you said at the beginning, this is the third report you've done, and I think there's clear trends that are being created throughout all three of the reports when you look at them as a collective. Obviously, the over-reliance on grants, but at the same time, there has been, despite all of the challenges that have been going on in the last 3 years, despite the fact that we live in times of unpredictability, we have no idea. It's completely new all the time. There is optimism, and there is progress as well for the sector. I think there has been a shift from sport being the main driver of the conversation to talking more about development issues that are being tackled, with sport being a methodology. And I think we can continue doing that. I think as a sector, the networks are doing great work in driving that conversation. The French Development Agency recently released a report on how to create indicators that are more aligned with the global goals and the development agenda. Common Goal are doing a similar work around a quality seal. There's also the Commonwealth have done this previously. So there is progress in those areas as well, which is going to help the sector do fundraising. I think the sector is ready to take the next step on that and have more of a thought leadership think tank type of organization, really driving that agenda. On an organizational level, I think we're seeing a lot more diversity as well. I think the social entrepreneurship and social business income stream, that's increased this year, which is something to be positive about. It's not for everyone, but it's something. And there's opportunities. I mean, corporate sponsorship is still an opportunity for corporate organizations, there's an opportunity, and individual donors, individual giving. I think that's an opportunity for organizations to explore as well. So despite the fact that there's been huge challenges for the sector has still progressed. And I think that we can take optimism from that. In its toughest time, organizations have really dug deep and have actually made progress. And I think we need to ensure that that's geographically spread across the board and isn't just focused on North America and Europe, but reaches everyone. But I think there's reason to be optimistic as well about the future for the sector and for fundraising in the sector.
Great, love that. Thank you, David. And Sally.
I mean, I echo everything that David said, and I know that we're on time. So I would just say the huge things are definitely like collective action, thinking about how we align and organize with other groups in this space. I see that in the chat, that folks are connecting with each other. I think that will help us in building more community, more consensus in the ways that we approach funders. And then lastly is really being diligent in how we budget. Right, we can only budget based. We should budget based on the revenue that we expect to have come in, and being diligent in that space. I think will position us to not only build sustainable organizations while fundraising, but also will position us to just make really smart decisions in how we grow and how we expand programs.
Well, thank you, Sally. And Nicole.
Yeah, just quickly, I echo everything both Sally and David said, and I think working together is essential. It's the progress in terms of collaboration, I think, in this space has been incredible over the past couple of years with COVID and post-COVID, and it just needs to continue. And I think we need to not look at this as a sort of zero-sum game of you get resources, I don't, but how do we as alliance organizations, as network organizations, but also as funders work together to create that collective impact, and not just think about this in really siloed programmatic, I fund you, you get funding from me kind of ways. So
yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Guys, thank you so much. We're immeasurably grateful for your support and contribution today. I hope everyone watching has found it as inspiring as I have. Final thanks as well to Common Goal, to Visa, and Laurie Scott for Good Foundation for being series partners and supporting us as always. The recording will be coming out over various channels over the next few days, and obviously the next webinar we've got planned for, I think, June or July, but again, we'll keep an eye out for that. We'll announce all that in due course. So one final thank you to the panelists. It's been amazing. Thank you so much, and apologies to every question that I didn't get to them. We'll try and get to them next time. But yeah, thank you all, and see you all soon.